Was your dad and or mom in the law business?
My father was.
Was he?
Yeah. Yeah, I was very much influenced by my parents, I have to say.
And were you born then in Canada?
I was born in Montreal. My mother was also born in Montreal. Her parents came from Minsk and Lithuania, and my father was actually born in Kovna, Lithuania, came to Montreal at a year old.
Ah.
Yeah.
So who's the greatest, Guy Lafleur or Jean Beliveau?
I'll tell you, I happen to have a particular affinity for Jean Beliveau as a person. I'm not saying anything against Guy Lafleur. I thought Beliveau was one of the most incredible people that ever played the game as a person.
Yeah. So you grew up with the Canadiens?
Oh yeah. But there's a commonality there. My father was a great hockey fan. He had season tickets, and I think I remember going to hockey games from the time. I almost go back to my infancy, but Beliveau was the one my father pointed out to me when he first came up from Quebec, and then he came to the Canadiens. He was playing, and he was an incredible person. I then accompanied him to the Maccabee Games in Israel. He was, I guess, a kind of mentor to the people in the Canadian Maccabean contingent. And then there's a funny story.
Sure.
In 2005, I always had a dream. I was then the Minister of Justice, but I always had a dream to play in the Maccabee Games. But of course, I didn't have any sport that I could really engage in. But I thought table tennis, so I went to the coach of the Canadian Maccabean team, and I said, could I try out for the table tennis team? And he said, you're on it. I said, I'm on it. He said, yeah, we have nobody. You're on it. So I went to the Maccabee Games in 2005, and in the first round, I drew the person who was the Israeli gold medalist who eventually won. But my son, tells a very funny story, because he always has a kind of humbling, mocking approach to me in a very good way. And he said to me, just before I left to play, he said, tell me that, is it a one-time elimination, in which case you'll be humiliated only once? Or is it a round robin, in which case you'll be humiliated day after day? So.
Well, that's another thing to add to your resume.
Yeah, it was an incredible experience, I have to say. The guy threw the first game to me, you see, because he didn't want me to be embarrassed. So, because I could never have won.
Yeah.
But my wife tells a story that the second game began, and I got a couple of lucky points just hitting the edge. And she said, all of a sudden, a look on his face. What? I gave him the first game. Who knows what might now happen? He beat me, as he should have, 21-4 or something. Yeah.
Well, what an opportunity.
Yeah, it was. It was an incredible experience. You have a dream that you want to play and be in the Maccabee Games, and there it was.
For the camera, what is the Maccabee Games?
Are we on camera?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know. I thought we were just.
You thought this was idle chat? No, this is the best part right now.
Okay. The Maccabee Games, it's considered the Jewish Olympics. It takes place every 4 years, and it brings together the best of Jewish athletes representing their respective countries from all over the world. That's why and my son looked at me so askance. I was not amongst the best of the athletes. In fact, it was more than just presumptuous for me to be there.
Oh my golly. So you, as far as being ultimately a lawyer, your dad was an influence. What came first, really, your international human rights interest and/or politics? I mean, you're a member of parliament and involved in a certain party. What came first?
Clearly, the human rights. I mean, you mentioned my dad of blessed memory. He was really my first human rights teacher, I could put it that way. I still remember my dad telling me, before I could understand the profundity of the message, when he would say to me that the pursuit of justice is equal to all the other commandments combined. This must be that which you will teach on to your children. And then it was my mother, who, when she would hear my father saying this, would say to me that if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice will simply be a theoretical abstraction. It was those early lessons, I guess then nurtured by people like Elie Wiesel, who became my mentor, colleague, etc., that got me involved in human rights and in what I called then the two great human rights struggles of the second half of the 20th century, the struggle for human rights in the former Soviet Union, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and to be involved with the two political prisoners who represented the face, the identity, the hope of those struggles, Anatoly Sharansky then in the former Soviet Union, and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So human rights came first. Politics and parliament was an accidental afterthought, I have to tell you.
So how does one get engaged in that? You obviously have to have an inclination and then an aspiration, and you just don't all of a sudden raise your hand and say, I want to assist in Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid. That doesn't happen. What's the road to that?
I had the, not only the inclination, but I think the passion that was ingested in me and by my family, my parents, I said, of blessed memory, and then I was lucky to have grown up in a community in Montreal of people who were very much engaged in social justice issues. We had one of the largest group of Holocaust survivors of any country in the world, and I grew up almost with them. In fact, my first client, if I could put it that way, pro bono client, my son always says, you've only had pro bono clients, were the Association of Survivors of Nazi Oppression, who came to me in the late 60s when I was graduating from law school at the time, and got me involved in what then became the struggle for anti-hate legislation and bringing Nazi war criminals to justice in Canada. The issue with regard to Sharansky grew out of my involvement in the Soviet Jewry movement, and it was a matter of accident in that a group of women from Montreal known as the 35s, they were very involved in the Soviet Jewry movement, met Avital Sharansky, Anatoly Sharansky's wife, who then had left the Soviet Union or been forced to leave, and she was looking for a lawyer, and they suggested me, and that's it. It was a matter of chance. I had neither the credentials nor even the knowledge of what needed to be done, but there it was, and that became my first real international advocacy case.
How did it work? You know, for the camera, to kind of educate the student to say, all right, I was introduced to the wife of Sharansky, now what? Now,
the first thing, at least, I had a little bit of the pedantic need as to say that I needed a power of attorney so that I could be holding myself out properly and effectively if asked, you know, as the lawyer for Sharansky. And then I instinctively almost developed an advocacy model that, frankly, I don't know what that says about me, that I'm almost still using to the present day. Some will say you haven't moved at all. But the first thing was to make representations to the human rights violator government, in that time the Soviet Union, anchored in the legal system of that government. So I made a petition to the Procurator General of the USSR that was anchored not in American law or Canadian, but in Soviet law. And I was then, in fact, invited to appear in a Soviet court for the first time by Soviet authorities to represent Sharansky, as an agreement brokered with the Canadian government. But what happened was a day before I was to appear to represent Sharansky in court, and I'll try to do this very quickly.
That's fascinating.
I was invited by the Sharansky family, who lived about 20 miles outside of Moscow, to visit them. They were holding a hunger strike to commemorate their son's imprisonment. And I just checked to make sure that everything would be all right. I asked the Soviet authorities if I could go visit the Sharansky family. They said, sure, why not? The Canadian embassy, I let them know I was doing this. I set off to the Sharansky family in the company of Professor Alexander Lerner, who was then what was called a refusnik of 11 years standing, a person who had applied to leave, was denied the right to leave, lost his job, etc. With him, his wife, and Sharansky's brother. And no sooner had we started on our way, some 10 minutes outside of Moscow, we were stopped by the Soviet militia, brought over to the side of the road, and then the interrogation began. The only person they wanted to interrogate was me. After some 40 minutes, they told everybody else, well, you can go on to the Sharanskys, we'll just go with Mr. Cotler back to Moscow. Professor Lerner, having a sense of what might happen, insisted on accompanying me back to Moscow, advised me that we were going back in the company of 2 KGB people. As we arrived in my hotel, where I told them I could show them all the permission for the trip, etc., 2 others exited the hotel. Professor Lerner told me these were 2 KGB people. I said, how did you know? He said, if you've lived here as we have, you know. Then he grasped my hand with what became a lifelong message, and he said to me, remember, whatever happens, don't ever let them intimidate you. Don't let them intimidate you. You're having a glimpse now in a short time of what for us is a way of life here in the Soviet Union. He grasped my hand and he said, remember, we are each, wherever we are, the guarantors of each other's destiny. A lifelong lesson. I was brought into the hotel. Somebody came into my room and said, Scott, you have 5 minutes to pack your bags and leave the Soviet Union. I was driven out to the airport at breakneck speed, up the ramp of a Japanese airliner, which fortunately was going to London and not the Far East. And sometimes there are certain moments which change history. The Japanese attendant, as I entered the plane, said, your boarding pass, sir. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm being boarded in unusual circumstances. And I pointed to the KGB people. And then I asked him, I said, if you can remember, please call the Canadian embassy. And I said, tell them I'm being expelled. And if you can call the Dan Fisher, the Moscow correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, tell him I won't be able to make it for dinner. Because that Japanese attendant did both those things, I arrived 4.5 hours later in London, and if you're expelled, it's a terrible feeling because you're worried about the people you've left behind. They seized all my documents. I was worried about those who might suffer because of this expulsion. I had been married 3 months in London. I get off the plane, I call my wife and I said, Ariella, don't tell anyone. You know, I've been expelled. She says, what do you mean don't tell anyone? It's all over the news. Dan Fisher, the Los Angeles Times, broke the news, and it was front page news. Nobody knew who I was, but everybody knew about Sharansky, who then was a co-celeb, and it was Sharansky's lawyer arrested, Sharansky's lawyer expelled. And so, like Andy Warhol said, everybody can have their 50 minutes of fame, but she then said to me, somebody from the Canadian High Commission, Canadian Embassy is looking for you, and they found me, and the Canadian government organized, at that time, a press conference in the Canadian Embassy so I could tell my story, because the Soviets were claiming I was a spy, etc., etc. And then when I returned to Canada, the foreign minister at the time, Flora MacDonald, in a symbolic move, met me at the airport, announced that all Canadian-Soviet bilateral Helsinki agreements were being suspended as a result of Sharansky's imprisonment and my expulsion. And then I was able to make the case with an international audience to follow. So then that came my second thing. If you can have or invoke the support of your own government in the defense of political prisoners, that helps. If the media can get engaged and shine a spotlight on the human rights violator, that helps. If you can engage, as happened then, the Canadian parliamentarians all supported my action, etc., and had a motion in the House of Commons, that helps. And so all these things, I had like a 10-point action plan that grew out of that whole Sharansky experience that then continued in all the cases I've been involved with since.
For the camera, what ultimately happened to Sharansky?
Sharansky was freed after 8.5 years in the Soviet prison. He had an incredible sense of humor, because when he walked across from East Germany to the West, as it had been arranged, and met his wife, she told me the first words he said to her was, "Sorry, I'm late." Yeah. And I met him because somebody, to this day I don't know who, gave me a complimentary ticket to fly to Israel so that I could meet Sharansky when he arrived in Israel to be together with his wife, and we met there for the first time, and we became and remained close friends, our families, and he ended up becoming a member of parliament and then a member of the government of Israel, including being a deputy prime minister. And now that he's retired from all that, he's basically involved in struggling for human rights issues. He's returned to his initial calling.
So you first meet the guy that you were his attorney and caused a lot of international exposure to, what did he say? What was that kind of initial conversation?
The initial conversation was an incredible conversation. I had never met him. As I said, I knew, of course, and been working together with his wife. Side issue is that my wife had been a friend of Sharansky's wife before I met my own wife. So there's a lot of interaction there. I gave him a copy of the legal brief, and he said to me, "Oh, I know all about that." He said, "You see, when I was sitting in prison," he said, I would get some newspaper from time to time, what they wanted me to read. He said, and there was this story one day that a lawyer, a Canadian spy, Irwin Cotler, came to the Soviet Union on behalf of the spy, Anatoly Sharansky. Looked up and he said, "Already I liked you." And then he said, the story went on to say, the Canadian spy, Irwin Cotler, had all sorts of espionage messages to deliver to Anatoly Sharansky. And he said, you wouldn't believe it. They printed some of those messages. They were letters from congressmen and senators that I wouldn't have known about, in letters of support on my behalf. He said, so I began to understand the international support that I didn't know I was having while I was in prison, and that was very encouraging. And then he said the last part of that article was that the spy, Irwin Cotler, was expelled from the Soviet Union for his espionage actions on behalf of the spy, Anatoly Sharansky. He said, they then wrote that I had failed in my mission. He said, no, they're wrong. Today, the spy, Irwin Cotler, is here in Jerusalem with the spy, Anatoly Sharansky. We succeeded, they failed. That was the first encounter, the first exchange that we had between us.
What a thrill. What a thrill. So did that kind of establish a little bit of a reputation for you in Canada, which then led perhaps to some of these other opportunities?
Well, as I said, it was part of the Andy Warhol fallout that had a little longer enduring momentum. I then got involved, I was commensurately involved in the anti-apartheid movement, but very quickly the story and how the stories connect is I come to South Africa as a guest of the anti-apartheid movement in 1981. I'm asked at the University of Witwatersrand, would I give a talk on on the Sharansky case, you see, because the Sharansky case was being built up in South Africa because they saw the Soviet Union as an enemy, etc. And I said, I'll be happy to speak on the Sharansky case, but I'd like to be able to talk on something like, if Sharansky, why not Mandela? And they said, well, why not? I said, well, because Mandela here, if you mention his name, it's a crime, and I don't want to get anybody into any difficulty. So these were students who invited me, and there was a brave group of students. They said, no, we want you to speak on that. And so there was a talk with placards and everything on, if Sharansky, why not Mandela? And Mandela was a banned person. The utterance of his name was an offense. And then I'm told it's one of the largest gatherings that ever took place during that anti-apartheid movement. And my wife was with me, and as she tells the story, I give my talk, and then she goes to see me, and I disappear. What happened? I got arrested in South Africa. And I'm sitting in the detention center, and somebody comes up to me and he says to me, do you know our foreign minister, Pik Botha? So I said, no. He said, well, he's summoned you and we've been instructed to bring you to see Pigbota. So I'm brought to Foreign Minister Pigbota's office, and I walk in and he said, Mr. Cotler, young man. And I said, yes. He says, do you know why I brought you here? I said, I have no idea. He says, right. He said, what's that picture on the wall? I look on the wall and there's a big picture of Sharansky. Yeah. And I said, well, that's Anatoly Sharansky. He says, right. He says, I could not understand how somebody like you, who could represent this great hero, Anatoly Sharansky, could speak in the same breath about this Nelson Mandela, this communist who's our enemy. And he went on in this vein. And I, went on to say, I said, well, both Sharansky and Mandela are fighting for the same thing. They're both fighting for democracy, for freedom, for equality. I will go, to cut it short, about 2.5 hours he tried to tell me why South Africa is a separate but equal country, democratic, free, etc. But at the end of it, I said to him, Mr. Botha, I hope you don't mind me saying so, but all I can tell you is that, yes, I said, the Soviet Union is an evil empire. I agree when you say that. I said, but South Africa is the only post-World War II country that has institutionalized racism as a matter of law. I said, apartheid is not just a racist philosophy, it's a racist legal regime, and I will fight this legal regime for as long as I can, from wherever I am, until, apartheid is defeated. And he said again what he had been saying during, you are a very brash young man. He said, but I'm going to let you go around South Africa for that. He said, I could expel you, I could imprison you, but I'm going to let you go around South Africa, see everything, and you come back after 10 days. He said, how long do you expect to stay here? I said, 10 days. You come back and tell me if I'm not right. We are a democratic, but separate but equal society. I come back 10 days later, and he says, so, young man, what do you have to say? I said, you're right. I said, South Africa is a free and democratic society. He said, I told you. I said, if you're white, I said, if you're colored or you're black, it's even worse than I thought. And then he repeated this thing, you're a brash young man, etc. Fast forward and to end this thing, the story, about 5 years ago, I was back in South Africa, and I decided to call up Pigbota, because I used to come to South Africa for reunions of the Mandela legal team. I was just a cameo player on that team, but I came back. Arthur Chaskelson, former president of the Constitutional Court, had been on Mandela's legal team. George Bezos had been on the team. We used to have a reunion. Every few years I'd come back to South Africa. I'd come back and I decided to call Pigbota. And he's in a senior citizens home, and he said he didn't want me to come and see him. He wanted me to remember him as he once was. He said, but I want to tell you something. He says, I followed you ever since we had that meeting. He said, so I know everything you've done. He said, I know you've become a member of parliament. I followed everything. But you probably don't know what I've been doing. So let me tell you what's happened since our meeting. He said, I became the first minister in the apartheid government to call for Mandela's release. I then became a minister in the government of Nelson Mandela, the anti-apartheid government that he created. And then he said, you as a brash young man may like to hear this, he said, the apartheid leader, became a member of the African National Congress, Mandela's party. Wow. He says, so you see, as a brash young man, some of your messages may have gotten through. So that was a fascinating exchange. He wrote me afterwards, and we maintained the relationship until he passed away just a year ago.
Oh, yeah. Now that you have this reputation, how do you vet out those cases which come to you because they would like you, Irwin Cotler, a notable celebrity attorney, that's my term, not yours, to come and represent their cause? I mean, I suspect you got a lot of requests.
Well, I usually, number one, it's important to me if the case or cause comes from an authoritarian or dictatorship country, because they're not only not able to be represented by counsel, there's no free media, free parliament, etc., but in fact the government is the violator, the imprisoner, and so on. So that's what's important to me. Can they have any effective counsel? And it's usually a case where they can't even have counsel. And the case I mentioned yesterday evening of Raif Badawi is a perfect example. Raif Badawi, the imprisoned Saudi blogger, his own lawyer was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And here too, same pattern. His wife and children had come to Canada as refugees. They approached me. It's a matter sometimes of par hasard, by circumstance or accident. And so I took up his case. And you have to be very careful that if you take on too much, you can't be effective. And you have to be able to take on cases where, as I said, there's a family or somebody who's able to give you an authority to act on their behalf, because you don't want to hold yourself out as representing somebody unless you have the full support and confidence of the family. So that's, for me, a very important. Another thing that I developed over time and understanding was every political prisoner that I've represented who's been lucky to be released has had a partner who's been out there advocating on his behalf or on her behalf while they've been in prison. Lately, in the last few years, I've noticed a number of women human rights defenders who've been imprisoned, whose cases and causes I've been asked to take up, one of them being Anastasia Sevchenko in Russia, who's now become the first political prisoner in the Russia's new foreign registration law, where even indigenous Russian NGOs, if they have a connection or perceived with an American NGOs, could be liable for imprisonment. And been asked to represent the leader of the opposition in the Philippines. This is the one country that is not a dictatorship but increasingly authoritarian. Senator De Lima, who's in prison, former Minister of Justice there, taken up her cause. And just before coming here, literally, I received a request from Judge Maria Afunis in Venezuela, who was imprisoned and tortured 10 years ago in Venezuela, is out of prison but still has no lawyer, and asked if I would take up her case. So the interesting thing is that over the past year, there are 3 women human rights defenders who have been imprisoned, whose cases I'm involved with now.
Do you have a group, a law firm or something that you're affiliated with that sort of helps do the research and all that stuff?
Well, you're right about that. When I was a law professor, that's the time that I was doing Sharansky Mandela, I was part of a legal community of professors and students, and there was a built-in, if you will, support system. Then when I went to Parliament, I had, if you will, the support system in the parliamentary arena, and I took up political prisoner cases selectively, because I was a member of Parliament. That was my first responsibility. But I saw the 2 dovetailing, representing political prisoners, advancing human rights. When I left Parliament 4 years ago, we established the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and in remembrance of and in tribute to Canada's first honorary citizen, Raoul Wallenberg, who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. Is credited with saving some 1,000 Jews during the Second World War, and who ended up himself being a political prisoner. So defending political prisoners is one of the main raison d'etre of our center. And I've got a few brilliant young lawyers who we work together. One of them is here with me in the conference, Brandon Silver. So we have a kind of little collective, and we have some young research assistants that work with us. We don't take on more cases, I believe, I'd like to say, than we can handle. But we take on those cases where we feel it could make a difference in terms of the importance and as principle and as precedent and in consequential impact. But these young people are fantastic. They're better than I ever was. And together we're trying to advance the case and cause of justice.
You're amazing. You got a lot of publicity of recently in the, where your members of parliament came to your defense when you were at a panel, and all of a sudden these guys walk up on stage. Did you have a sense this might occur, or did it come out of the blue?
No. I had a sense it might occur. I didn't have a sense it might occur because it's not the first time that the same group has done it. The backstory is, the first time it occurred was 2 years ago. I was on a panel with Romeo Dallaire, the great hero of the Rwandan genocide. There can be a hero. And he and I were on a panel, and this same group disrupted us then, largely at the time because they felt somehow that we were both agents of imperialism, etc. I was an agent of imperialism in supporting the state of Israel. I don't know why, because to me it was a clearly false allegation against Romeo Dallaire. Fast forward to now. This same group disrupted again, and mainly at this time on the Palestinian issue, somewhat subsidiarily on the Venezuelan issue. That's where the imperialism thing came in, and I was accused by them of supporting the apartheid state, Israel. I couldn't even engage in dialogue because they were not even interested in dialogue. It was a kind of disruptive diatribe.
You had to be heartened to have your members of parliament all kind of rally around both parties.
Well, it was interesting. It was surprising because I was no longer a member of parliament. Somehow they heard about it in parliament, and it was an all-party support for what had happened, and they. I think the Canadian parliamentarians just saw this as being a kind of disruptive intervention on the part of the protesters, and not ones willing to dialogue, but just only willing to attack.
Right. Last night you won the Josh Heinz Award at the Robert Jackson Center. I should ask Irwin Cotler, what does Robert Jackson mean to an Irwin Cotler in your work?
Well, he is a hero to all of us who are engaged with the combating of mass atrocity in our time, and the combating of impunity, the bringing of war criminals to justice. In fact, one of the books I edited was Nuremberg 40 years later, and which were the proceedings of a conference around that name. One of the heroes who's been part of these dialogues, Ben Friends, was part of that conference, and Justice Jackson was really a kind of inspirational moment for us at that conference that we had at McGill University. We harken back to him as during that conference, and therefore anybody who seeks justice and accountability must engage with the words and the decisions of Justice Jackson. So for me, he's someone who, while I never met, of course, was a mentor for all that we do. An accidental parliamentarian. The sitting member of parliament in the riding in which I lived, we have a constituency system, not unlike the United States. And she was appointed to the Senate, and therefore there was a vacancy in our riding. And a few people asked me to run, not that many, and I said, no, I'm not interested. I'm very happy doing what, and I was, being a law professor, doing human rights work, etc. I remember going overseas. I had a grandson that was born. I came back. I found three things. One, that there were 3 candidates for the Liberal nomination in my riding. 2, that the deadline for nominations was 3 days away. And 3, that in my absence, a kind of grassroots movement, I think largely organized by my wife, had grown up to support my candidacy. But I just was utterly uninterested. On Yom Kippur, which was 2 days before the deadline for nominations, at the end of the services, the rabbi got up and said, "We're going to draft Irwin Cotler for the nomination. He hasn't agreed, but you're invited to come to his house 2 hours after the fast." And a whole group came, and I wasn't being coy, I just was not interested. The day of the deadline for nomination, somebody rings my doorbell. I open the door, and he says to me, "I'm Jonathan Herman, you don't know who I am?" And he said, "But I've been told to pick you up, to take you down, to take out your nomination papers." I said, "But I'm not running." And he said, "Well, let's go for a drive, because my instructions are to take you." So as we're driving, 2 of the 3 candidates called to say they were withdrawing and calling a press conference to support my nomination. The 3rd then withdrew in the afternoon. By about mid-afternoon, there were no candidates for the Liberal nomination. So my wife said to me, because she knew how to get to me, she said, "Look, the sitting member who was appointed to the Senate only had 1 year left in her mandate. Why don't you go to Parliament for 1 year, look at it as a sabbatical, come back, you'll be a better law professor." I said, "You know what, that I'm prepared to do, to go for a year." And so I went for a year, and I stayed 15. And that's how I became a parliamentarian.
And then you got involved in the post of the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. And,
yeah. That also was somewhat accidentally, because I said I was going there for a year, and at the end of that year, again they said, "Well, you know, you've been here for a year, but at least do 1 term." So I said, "Okay, I'll do 1 term." And in that term, midway through, the Prime Minister calls me up and he says, "What do you do with somebody who has some crazy ideas about the pursuit of justice?" So I said to him, "Well, I don't think pursuing justice is that crazy." And then these are the words, and he said, "Well, congratulations, Irwin, you're the new Minister of Justice. You'll be sworn in tomorrow afternoon. You'll be..." That's exactly how it occurred. I neither sought the office, nor was even, some might say, prepared for it, but I became the Minister of Justice, and I have to say, one of the most fascinating periods of my life, because it's an opportunity to, because somebody once said to me, "What's the difference between being a law professor and being a parliamentarian and being a minister?" I said, "The law professor, which I loved doing, but it was an ongoing seminar, a kind of lifelong seminar." I said, "But if you're a Minister of Justice, you're making decisions, and you can have an impact with the decisions you make." So I said, for me, it was like having the best blessings of 2 worlds. The long years of seminars as a law professor allowed me to be a better Minister of Justice and to make decisions about justice.
And you were Minister of Justice, what, about 3 years?
About 2.5, yeah. Because we got defeated not long into our mandate.
Just Justin Trudeau, or Paul Martin?
Paul Martin, yeah. I always said about Paul Martin, the best Prime Minister that Canada never had the opportunity to fully experience. Yeah. He was a remarkable democratic, open, engaging Prime Minister. And he accomplished wonderful things in his 2.5 years, but I always lamented the fact that there wasn't another longer mandate.
Well, talk about an honor. I'm sure when Nelson Mandela's funeral and Canada had to send a representative, you were permitted to go on behalf of Canada and actually took Prime Minister Trudeau's position. Is that right?
Well, that's yeah. Well, you know, in the adversarial nature of even Canadian politics at the time, when the funeral came about, Harper invited the party leaders to go. Somebody suggested to him to invite me, but I think I was a liberal. You know, I'm not sure that's something, but I think to some of his people at least. But Justin Trudeau, who's then the leader of our party, did not, said he won't go and sent me in his place. I think what Harper should have done is to allow Trudeau to go. And I could have maybe accompanied him, but Trudeau was insistent that I represent him. And that's how I was there at the funeral. How did you know about that, though?
I read that someplace.
Yeah. I thought that said something about Trudeau, you know, because he had the opportunity to go and to be there and have a central place at the funeral, and he said, no, I'm not going. I want Irwin to represent us. Yeah.
You won the Magnitsky Award and a variety of references to him. Tell me your connection to that.
Well, in 2010, I was in England visiting with some parliamentarians in England at the time, amongst them John Mann. We formed the Interparliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism. I appeared before the UK Parliament on some other matters, and someone said, person Bill Browder, who wants to see you. And Bill Browder told me everything about the Magnitsky case, and he so inspired me and asked me if I would, on my return to Canada, introduce Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation in the Canadian Parliament, which I did in the fall of 2011. There's another part that all connects together. Boris Nemtsov was then the democratic leader in the Russian parliament, one of the great Democrats in Russia as a whole. He came to support my Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation. He became, together with Bill Browder, proponent for this internationally. He came back again and had another press conference with me as I was trying to move that legislation forward. Tragically, he was assassinated in 2015, and Russia lost the greatest opportunity for a real democratic initiative and development. But we continued to champion the Magnitsky legislation until it was 2015. One of my last acts in the Canadian Parliament was to move a motion to get this legislation adopted, and the motion was unanimously passed. And then in the new Parliament, which I was no longer a member of, it became legislation, and since then, not only has the Magnitsky Act been adopted, but in its global character, global Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, and we have since applied it to human rights violators, not only in Russia, but in Venezuela, in Saudi Arabia, in Sudan, and the like. So it's a very important part of our pursuit of justice, of our combating impunity. And one of my most moving days was when we were able to have the widow of Sergei Magnitsky and his son come to the Canadian Parliament on the day that we adopted the Magnitsky legislation. So, and that's a main plank of our Wallenberg advocacy, and that is global justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, accountability for human rights violators, combating impunity, combating the cultures of corruption and criminality and the impunity that underpin it. All this is bound up with our Magnitsky work and in memory of this great hero.
I must personally, for the tape, thank you and the March of the Living for recognizing the work we do at the Jackson Center in Krakow a couple of years ago, when that was a special moment for me, especially as a Gentile, to be so honored and to be brought as part of that March of the Living and being embraced and encompassed and recognized. And I know you were intimately involved in that, so I want to personally thank you.
Well, thanks. I had the privilege of being a co-chair of that, and I should tell you that there's a book that's come out on the proceedings of that conference.
Really?
Yeah, I'll send it to you. It's really I think a good set of proceedings, because some of the people who are here were at that conference. Luis Moreno Ocampo. We had just a wonderful grouping of people who were there at the time.
Well, one of your designees, I don't know exactly if that's the correct term, for the Supreme Court of Canada was our lecturer here at Chautauqua last year, Justice Abella. And we met her at that event.
That's right. She was one of the members of the Supreme Court Justices panel that we had at that event. We had the Chief Justice from Rwanda on that panel. We had the Justice Abella. She's a marvelous jurist. I think one of the great, not just Canadian jurists, but international jurists. We happen to be close friends, and I had the privilege, I might put it, to have been a Minister of Justice in the government that appointed her to the court. And as I've always thought, that was one of the best decisions our government ever made. She's been an incredible jurist. She has a command, an interdisciplinary command of not just the Canadian legal system, but systems abroad, and she can invoke international law, comparative law, American law where appropriate, etc. A marvelous jurist.
Well, she wowed everybody here at Chautauqua Institution 2 years ago, and it was just remarkable. You're remarkable. Do you ever sit back and have a chance, because I know you're so active, to sort of reflect on what you've accomplished?
No, I just feel that the challenges are always there, and it's our responsibility to just continue to use the motto of the Wallenberg Center to pursue justice as best we can, one case and cause at a time, in the hope that we can bring about a better humanity for us all. I know that may sound like a cliche, but that's what these young people we're engaged with are helping to move forward for us. So it's something that you can't rest with this, because every day that you get up, there is somewhere an atrocity that is continuing, or a political prisoner that's imprisoned, or a cause that has to be taken up. And so it gives meaning to life, I have to tell you.
Well, I look forward to the time in our area here at the Jackson Center, Chautauqua Institution, which has a significant number of Canadian people who attend events here, to maybe bring you down to talk about your work, because I got to believe it would resonate broadly in this specific audience, especially during the season, the Chautauqua season. So.
Well, I heard some of it about that this morning when we began, and I was very inspired. I was saying to myself, this is a place that I have to bring my family down so that they can experience it, because as it was discussed this morning, this is a place that every summer is engaged itself in the pursuit of justice in the best sense, with young people, and moving us forward in that regard. So it'd be a great place to be able to experience what is happening here.
Well, we look forward to that. I'm just so thrilled you could join us and be with us for the next couple of days. So thank you, and congratulations on last night.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to be here. And as I say, I don't come for a one-time thing or an award. I came here to be enriched by the experience, to learn from those who are here teaching us. So it's a great place to be.
Well, we're honored with your presence. Thanks so much.
Thank you.